Paul Brewbaker is an economist of some note in the state, and his talk today is people have been asking about the economy. We've been talking about the economy. Let's just get some real numbers on the table and see where that goes. So, Paul, you're next. You want to hook that up? Judy?
You all right? Thanks, you guys. Mahalo for inviting me over. I do have to apologize in advance. I'm not a facilitator, and so I wouldn't be good at organizing and moving a dialogue along. I was asked to make about a 20-minute presentation, so I've worked on that, and I'm going to do that. I'll try to answer a few questions, but I realize you guys want to talk amongst yourselves, and that's not something I'm going to be really good at helping out. I was asked to talk about some of the economic impacts, and as is typical when people ask me to do that, of TMT, and as is typical when people ask me to do that, it turns out to be nothing like what they thought they were going to get. So I'm just going to warn you about that to begin with. And I'm actually going to use an analogy because I am not an astronomer. And in fact, I'm pretty sure the last time I took a real physics course was at Kailua High School in 1973. So yeah, I am not the world's leading expert on the astronomy or astronomical based research sector in Hawaii. But I think in watching what's unfolding, I think there's some really interesting analogies from something I'm more familiar with, and this is kind of a family thing too. So as if things weren't controversial enough, I'm going to use genetic modification as a counterexample. And I'll bring you back to the subject in just a second. So let me indicate Judy, who is, I guess, my contact this evening, Donna, who had contacted me on behalf of the Development Corp, and Richard, who is to blame for my being here, because whenever Richard asks, I always show up, even though I have no idea what we're getting into. If you'd like a copy of these slides, I'll burn a PDF and make it available through Donna, so the Community Development Corporation can make that available to you as needed. And so I won't read the bullet points, and but I'll explain to you what I have here for future reference if you want to come back to it. So the history, you may know my dad's the corn guy, so the history of corn in Hawaii goes way back. And interestingly, like telescopes on Mauna Kea, goes back about 50 years. And all of a sudden, they're controversial after 50 years. So let me kind of walk you through. This is what I know about the telescopes. I went to Wikipedia and got a quote. So yeah, when I first started doing a little background on this, I was struck by the fact that we're talking in both cases about something that happened when I was a small kid. And at Wailupi Valley Elementary School. And so it strikes me as, it's really striking to me how, now they're controversial. And I'm, I used to be 5 and now I'm not. So it was interesting listening to Hulalai talk about voyaging and whatnot, because now that we have Google Earth, you can just look at the Earth and figure out why telescopes on the top of Mauna Kea made a lot of sense to the people who were thinking about where to put them. Because this is what the Earth looks like in our half of it, and the other half has too many cities. That's like the whole thing. Here's another interesting thing to amaze your friends with. If you take away the Jones Act, will the boats go from China to North America by stopping in Hawaii? No, and they can already stop in Hawaii if they want, anyway. So. And so I started thinking, so what exactly is problematic now about some of these areas of successful development of science-oriented economic activity in the islands, when for a half century they sort of seemed to just be sort of growing and going along. I have to confess at the outset, I'm not sure I understand the conflict between natural resource stewardship or cultural resource stewardship or fulfilling our aspiration to know more about the universe. I'm wondering what happened at the Big Bang. I actually kind of wonder about that. And it blows my mind that the universe might be 13.7 billion years old. That's like, really? Not 13.8? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, So let me walk you through some of the economic backdrop here, and I'm going to move to the other side because I can't keep turning around looking at the screen, and it's better if I look at this one. Okay, so here's the thing with corn. This is a chart of corn yields in America in bushels per acre from the time of Gregor Mendel's publication of the first path-breaking paper on genetics in 1866 to the time when my grandfather got his PhD in genetics, which was a new science in those days. And my dad tells me that 24, 25 bushels per acre, which was yields 100 years ago, were approximately the same as in the classic Maya period, 1,000 years before that. And we know from archaeological evidence that people began eating corn or evolutionary precursors about 9,000 years ago. So, say 10,000 years, people basically got about the same result. And then all of a sudden, the application of genetics increased yields 8-fold. So we reduced the amount of land that was required to grow a bushel of corn by 85% in the lifetime of my father. That's kind of amazing. That's one of these, for 10,000 years, everybody did this way, and all of a sudden now we're driving SUVs and using Bluetooth to talk on our phones so the police don't pull us over. A lot of people are concerned about transgenic modification, which is one of many ways of undertaking genetic modification. And so this is just a chart, you can get the slides, this is just a chart of the two sort of grand slams in transgenic modification, which basically are the only things that have ever succeeded in its 20-year history. But to give an example, by removing something in a bacillus that's in the soil, if you walk around barefoot, that is distasteful to the corn borer, U.S. corn farming, which is now more than 90% BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, or HT, herbicide-tolerant corn, has reduced corn insecticide use by 90% in the last 50 years. So we've reduced the amount of land required by 85%, we've reduced insecticide use by 90%. So, this to me is really fascinating, having grown up around these people. But when I'm contacted by reporters to talk about ag economics, they always want to talk about food, and nothing personal. All my friends in agriculture, like Richard, are involved in that, or floors or whatnot. And my grandfather was a rancher, and I grew up for about 5 minutes on this ranch in Colorado. But until a few years ago, even in Hawaii, agriculture was no longer primarily about food. About a third of agriculture was all of this genetic research. Now that's changed, but yeah, I grew up, this is my dad in his cornfield in a location I won't mention because I don't want you guys, getting all worked up about it. And my grandfather started the corn seed industry. So this is the farm that Syngenta or DuPont is gonna close now, 3,000 acres in Kekaha, and no red dirt. But so yeah, this was, as I say, my first job ever was on that, hoeing weeds on that farm, by the way. And then, of course, through these interrelationships and, sort of the ohana of Hawaii agriculture, I've gotten to know people like Danny Leffler, who I understand isn't even growing corn anymore, and Richard, of course. So, for me, that's been kind of I always looked at agriculture as a knowledge-based kind of an activity, because that's what I grew up with, that's what my dad was doing, that's what, I was supposed to get good grades for. And when you look at agriculture, when most people look at agriculture, they think of, how many papaya are we gonna harvest? I always think of the benefits of, the dynamic benefits of the growth of knowledge that's been enabled by ag R&D. And as I say, until recently, just in the maize genome, ag R&D was about a third of Hawaii agriculture. Or put it differently, ag R&D in the maize genome was bigger than sugar, the entire sugar industry at its peak before the demise of Hamakua plantation, to give you an example. Now, it's also declined by $100 million in the last 2 years. Oops, so that's what's going on right now, and people don't understand that, and hopefully I'll get another consulting contract so I can figure that out. That's a pretty hard right turn for an industry that was the fastest growing area of agriculture. And so bringing this back to TMT, you have to kind of be careful what you wish for. If you've had an industry that's been growing for 50 years and all of a sudden you just shut it down, there could be some serious impacts to consider. What we're talking about on the ag side goes way back. My dad actually started in the Philippines in the 50s, where rice research was either rice yields in the US and the world. So you guys can get the slides, the links, not in this slide, but usually the links are in the sources. Here's a comparison of the corn slide you looked at earlier with wheat. So this is something that really happened. This is World War II. I'm sorry, this is World War II right here. This is really something that happened in the modern era and has brought us to the brink of, solving world hunger. But it raises the bigger picture of just how the modern era differs from, so if you look at, a Chinese peasant or a French peasant before Copernicus published his thesis of heliocentric orbits in the solar system, right? So what is that, 1538. Their standard of living in the 16th century was approximately the same as the standard of living of an Egyptian peasant in the 3rd millennium BC. Okay, so 10,000 years we all ate the same amount, and now we're obese and diabetic because we're so productive. It turns out GDP per capita in the United States, adjusted for inflation, has grown at a steady 2% rate after inflation, right, since World War II. So you just wake up every year, download the latest app, and you get 2% productivity growth, right? It just falls like manna from heaven. Well, not really. It's because people are doing all this stuff. And it's interesting that Hawaii got on the train early, so here's statehood. And Hawaii's GDP per capita grew faster than the US until I graduated from high school, which of course is why, right? That's all the baby boomers' fault. After that, Hawaii GDP per capita did not grow as fast. It went from being higher than the US at its widest point, literally, when I, went to college, and today matches the US. But what's problematic is if you look at a measure for which we have neighbor island data, this is personal income per capita. So this is income accruing to all households, okay, as opposed to GDP, which is a broader measure. Income accruing to all households from all sources. So here's the 50s, right? Here's sort of the catch a wave, Burns, Ariyoshi, Senator Inouye, we named a highway for him. That's a period in which real per capita income in Hawaii doubled in about the first 2 decades of statehood. And then in the last 3 decades, it's only increased by about a quarter. So it's slowed down significantly. And here's what's worse. For the neighbor islands, if you go back to this moment in the 70s, the growth rates both on Oahu and the neighbor islands have been slower than the US. So the neighbor island trajectory is departing to the downside from from the US average. So even with the ability to just upgrade every year with the new apps, neighbor islands are falling behind, and Oahu is about to stumble, I think, in the next 10 or 15 years. And this is kind of a serious issue if you're raising children and you aspire for them to succeed economically and, philosophically or whatever, morally. It's hard to do when it's, when we're not keeping up. So as I think about why that's true, clearly there were several distinct changes that accelerated Hawaii's path in the mid-20th century. Statehood was one. It's a political risk factor for investment. Passenger jet aviation, that was a big one, okay, jets. And then this rise of what I call knowledge-based industries, which include astronomy, plant genetics, ocean and earth sciences, and this stuff we've learned. And Hawaii's really been a laboratory in a number of different fields, and I think continues to be making contributions. But for some reason, there's drag being exerted, and I think it's something in the economics literature that's sometimes called black hole economics, which is, the more energy that goes in, the less that comes out. Let me put this in perspective. The neighbor islands, I think, are in a particularly problematic situation for one reason at least, is that they don't really have the benefits that come from urban agglomeration, which are the literature now suggests that it's just the nature of information technology that underscores the advantage of urban agglomeration. And it's tougher to be a rural area or a non-metropolitan area in America in the 21st century because of the nature of technology. That's the thesis. But we can go back 2 centuries, and of course the 19th century was a period of absolute population decline, but I think few people remember that the middle 20th century, from the 1930s to the 1960s, populations on the neighbor islands declined absolutely. And that was kind of the mechanization era of plantation economy. The people left the neighbor islands for 30 or 40 years until these changes happened after statehood that gave all of Hawaii a boost, but in particular accelerated the neighbor islands. And now that seems to have petered out. And anybody thinking about the future ought to be thinking about why that might be true. Let me give you 2 examples of what I think are problematic, but they have to do with the way we manage growth. And the canonical example is the change in the way the Land Use Commission used to operate. So it used to be the Land Use Commission said, okay, let's have a meeting, let's have a dialogue. Where should the next 5,000 acres of urban land be? And so they would make a decision, and that's where you would urbanize. Well, in 1974, they changed that, and they said, okay, now we're gonna have a contested case hearing. So you have a dialogue with attorneys, and then when we're finished, we'll maybe let you build something. Second example is, you may not know this, but on net there hasn't been a new hotel room or transit accommodation built in Hawaii in about 25 years. So let's take a look at the data. This may surprise you. These are numbers of housing units authorized by building permits. So here again, here's that boom I talked about. Here's the Depression, World War II, the pre and the territorial and statehood era explosion, and then here's where we changed the rules of the game, and now we're approximately building half of what our need is in terms of new housing for new household formation by children who have reached adulthood. So we don't provide our own people with enough housing. These are the actual data. If you take the amount of production divided by the existing housing stock, so in terms of percent, right? So we used to build about 4 or 5% of the housing stock every year. That's a 0.04. We used to build about 4% of the housing stock, 1% of it which is falling apart because the termites stopped holding their hands, and so the house falls apart. And now we're building, something like 4 or something like that. And you guys are looking at like what? I got these slides out of order. This is the way it plays in the newspaper, right? There's too many condominiums being built. That's a friend of mine wrote this article, and just to be fair to any reporters in the room, the guy that writes the story doesn't write the headline. So it's not his fault. And it's not my fault either, who I got quoted in here. So here's the second example. So yeah, count them up. We haven't built a new transit accommodation on net in Hawaii, basically for like 25 years. Right? So since, Hualalai. And I love, Kukio Resort. What kind of resort doesn't have transit accommodation? That's just a subdivision, right? I live in a subdivision, it's not a resort. So, and the problem with not increasing your productive capacity, whether it's housing, you made babies, so, right, then babies grow up, or tourism, which is our principal export, is that at some point you can't grow it. Somebody has to move, right? And so with tourism, even though we have more bodies coming. For 25 years, the constant dollar value of tourism has been declining. Visitor expenditure adjusted for inflation has been declining for 25 years. So this can't be a good thing if it's your principal export. I mean, unless you do think it's a good thing and then somebody has to leave. And that's kind of the dilemma I see in the debate. And there's more details, right? This is arrivals and expenditure more recently. Here's expenditure. So the neighbor islands, right, which actually have, right, Oahu has 85% occupancy on a seasonally adjusted basis. So we're sold out. Oahu's sold out, so it's just musical rooms. So whoever pays the most gets the room. Neighbor islands still have some room to grow, but you're up to, what, 70-something% occupancy, not quite on the Big Island. And so here's the problem. If the leading sectors, the military, tourism, and whatnot, are in decline, they're absolutely outright in decline, and they're like the big dogs. And then you have a few knowledge-based industries that have actually been growing and now are suddenly hitting opposition. After 50 years, they're hitting opposition. What are we to make of the governor's assertion that we should be disinvesting, right? We should have fewer telescopes, or maybe fewer. I mean, where does that go? Fewer hotel rooms? I know some people who advocate that. This is, like I say, it's a real dilemma for Hawaii's economic future. If Mauna Kea is the best place on the planet for advanced telescopes, and we're not going to do that, then okay, let's go down the list of what's left. It's not a long list. We live in a reasonably diverse economy, and you can't see this from the back, but this is GDP by industry. The part of the economy that's been growing are these private services and information producing industries, but we don't make things anymore. And the things that have been declining the last several years are tourism, the federal sector, and believe it or not, construction, although we do think that's gonna change now. I mean, I've been saying that for several years. And I'll skip through some of this. If you look at the list of real performers in terms of risk-adjusted returns, so just bear with me for a second. This measures the growth rate in the last expansion, but then this is the volatility of that growth. So for example, the film industry has a really high growth rate and is the most volatile of any sector in the economy because, like, you know, either you have Lost or you have no TV show at all, or you have, you know, Magnum PI, and then for 15 years there's nothing that gets picked up by the networks. Professional, technical, and scientific services, computer systems and design. Construction is cyclical, so it goes up and then it goes down. You know, these were relatively reliable sectors in the last expansion, but again, the question is, where do you go from here? And this point about, in terms of risk-adjusted growth, that's really important because that's the world we live in. So here's the context for, you know, the neighbor islands right now. Job growth was pretty good, and then it petered out. Job growth on the neighbor islands, this series right here, has not reached the previous peak and hasn't changed in about 6 months. So, you know, things could get better, but they already stopped. Here's the home building data in a close-up since the LUC. So here's the neighbor islands. Now, I say there is some hope for construction. This is a chart of private building permits for new buildings. So I'm going to take out the photovoltaic panel installations because that's equipment. It's not a building. It's on the building, but it's not a building. So if you look at the authorizations for new buildings and the cycle over the last, you know, 40 years, you can see we're entering what looks like a new cycle. Here's the trend component. So I'm more confident about that. But on the list of things we were going to build was TMT. So this is what TMT looks like. So here's the whole point of why I think I got invited. So what I did is I took the data, published data on how much they're going to spend to build it, and then how much is going to be spent, you know, operating it over time. I passed the thing through the state's input-output model, and you get this pulse. So you get this is in constant 2010 dollars, and then because I'm looking out about 40 years, 10 years for constructing the telescope, 30 years of operational life is what I assume. What happens is you go out to the 2050s, and discounting the future crushes the future values, right? So you'd rather have 1 billion today than 1 billion tomorrow, and 1 billion 10 years from now is worth even less. So that's just discounting. And I've discounted at two rates. I've discounted at 3%, and I've discounted at 6%. And again, these are in constant dollars, so there's no inflation in this world. So it's a world with 2% productivity growth, and I discount the future at 3 to 6% rate. 3, if I'm kind of more of a, moralist as an environmentalist, and I think more in terms of sustainability. 6, if I'm like a capitalist dog, from Bishop Street, and I think you're just gonna crush the future. So, and you get an idea what the picture looks like. So this is $300 million per year in economic impacts, plus or minus, over the next 10 years, coming from the Big Island. And somebody already asked a question, well, what about the fact that the money is leaving the state? So here's the thing. When you go to Walmart and buy all the cheap stuff that you love, right? Or KTA, either way, you know what I mean? If you're uncomfortable with the fact that your iPhone is from China, just buy Apple stock. You see what I mean? Because if you think the profits are leaving the state, then if you own the company, they're your profits. I rest my case. That's the world. That's how the world works. And if you don't think your union pension fund isn't invested in Walmart or Apple, you need to check it out, because it's okay. That's how the world rolls today. So you have this pulse. That's an investment pulse. Happens all the time. This one happens to be kind of a big one. And then we settle in, and there's 150 guys, 100 guys. I don't know. Men and women, children. I don't know. Aliens, maybe, that work at the telescope, and so they generate economic benefits on an ongoing basis. And because there may be an accountant in the room, I'm a recovering bank economist, so I used to have to hang out with accountants, and they love numbers. So here's the numbers, and I got bullet points with the numbers. So here's how the entire input-output model of the state works. You give me a number, I multiply by 2. Or so. So a 1.4 billion in construction is 2.8 billion in impacts, including the fact that my iPhone comes from China, right? That all of the leakages and imports are calibrated in the state's model. So it's all in there. And then of course we're discounting the future, right? So the part of the 2.8 billion that comes at the end of the 10 years is not worth as much as the part at the front. So if I discount at 6%, I get down to 2.2 billion from 2.8. Now, these are in 2010 dollars, and it's 2015. Oops, we forgot to build the TMT. So 5 years later, and 35% higher construction costs, you do the math, 1.4 billion is actually 1.8 billion in dog years, and so, but you can do your own math. So you get the idea, right? Multiply by 2, and then make sure you discount future values. In terms of operational contributions, now the discounting is more crushing because the operations are out in the future. So non-discounted is almost 2.5 billion over the life of the project. But of course, we're discounting, from 2050 back to 2015, and it's about $1 billion or change at 3%, and about a lousy 700 million discounting at 6%. So those are the numbers. You can calculate them. That's what I get. We're talking about a project with somewhere between $3 and maybe $3.5 billion in the present value of future economic benefits. And sorry, I'm not here to talk about costs. So just to wrap up, we don't live in an economy that produces things in Hawaii anymore. Everybody else on the planet produces things better, faster, and cheaper. And it's a miracle of modern logistics that I can go down to Costco every day, or KTA. I can go down to KTA every day and get fresh strawberries. What? How is that even possible, right? If I don't like the price at Target, right, in Kailua now, we used to have Dae. Now we have Target, which is Dae for Holly guys, right? I go inside Target. Hey, I don't like the price. I go Target.com. Hey, cheaper. Bro, they ship it to the store, free. Mainland pricing, right? So that's the world we live in now. And the thing that we have left that distinguishes us, besides our culture and our history, particularly unique in both senses, is the fact that we do certain services and information better than other people, right? We know celestial navigation, or we have people that know that here. And so we've already become a services and information producing economy, and in particular, a knowledge-based economy. That already happened. Now, there's a host of problems that come with that, right? So why are the rich getting richer? Because if you dropped out of high school in the last 10 years, your lifetime earnings are less, absolutely, even if you joined the union, than they were 50 years ago when I worked at Dole Cannery, well, actually 40 years ago, right? All the union guys at Dole, all the ILW guys at Dole Cannery, right? None of them finished high school. They all got their job in World War II, right? I was a forklift driver. They all sat around all day telling war stories and making the young guys drive the forklifts. Bro, if you drop out of high school today, your lifetime earnings adjusted for inflation are less than those buggers in 1970, whatever was that, summer of 1970. Less, bro. However, if you went to college, male or female, way more, multiples of what your earnings were, right? That's the way the economy has evolved in a way that rewards knowledge and skills accumulation. And that's how we roll. You know what I mean? It gives us the luxury, the wealth, the income, to go restore the sacred sites, bro. We have enough money to do that. Before we were working down at the mill 6 days a week. You know what I mean? Which we had to live by because we couldn't afford a car. Right? You ever wonder, how the hell did they build a town in Honokaa? Where did Honokaa come from? Because the mill! You had to live within walking distance of the mill. Right? That's not the world we live in. And I can go through all this stuff, you know, about the multipliers and this and that, but what I think is the most important about the nature of these scientific based industries is two things. One, it enables global collaboration between people in Hawaii and the rest of the world in a variety of dimensions, not just the scientific one. And second, Hawaii has made pivotal contributions to our understanding of the universe in this particular case. So, respect for the Aina, etc. Here's the challenge. This is not an ethnocracy. This is not a theocracy, right? We have a democratic process that we have to respect. It works really well, especially when there's dialogue. And so I encourage you to remain active and have your voice heard, and let's use that process to our benefit. In my opinion, in my economic opinion, the path forward inevitably involves coexistence of the host culture and of these new knowledge-based industries that even the ones we haven't even thought of yet. And I'll stop at that.
Thank you, Paul. A couple of questions. I think there are people who took a little umbrage with the GMO conversation. Certainly that's a piece that has a lot of... put it down. So I don't really need to get into the individual questions, but just acknowledge the fact that there were some people who really didn't feel that was a connection that they're comfortable with. So, but there are a couple of questions here about the role of environment and the degree to which there's an economic benefit for the protection of the environment and for the maintenance of environmental integrity. And is that something you could chat with a little bit? He said, there's no doubt that telescopes cause an adverse effect atop Mauna Kea. If we don't have an environment, would there be an economy?
So I think Wally actually did the best job touching on this area. So we understand there are adverse impacts. I mean, you're all going to drive your cars home and not pay for the atmospheric carbon loading. So me too. And that's a failure in public policy. You know, I don't understand why we don't pay for atmospheric carbon loading, right? If I were the Konehiki of, you know, DLNR, which I'm not, I would call up the kids at Laupahoehoe Community Public School and have them make a website, and they'd model it after, the auction part. You guys play World of Warcraft? My girlfriend, she's a big gamer. World of Warcraft, right? MMORPGs. Massive multiplayer online role-playing games. You know about this? So they have these auctions. The MMORPG guys have these auction markets. They're synthetic auction markets, and a high school student could build a website that auctions atmospheric carbon credits. And then we would all have to pay, like we pay for the registration of our car, based on how many tons of atmospheric carbon we emit, which is every Saturday afternoon, you can watch Motor Week on public television, and it will tell you how much each car's atmospheric carbon loading is. So mitigation is the answer to environmental externalities, which I doubt are so ubiquitous that we're worse off because of it, but there's no question that we're wealthy enough as a society to engage in that mitigation. And as Wally mentioned, once upon a time, nobody did nothing. And this slowly but surely, we've sort of built up an apparatus of mitigation, and I'm sure we're not doing enough. But I'm even more sure that we have the ability to do it because we're wealthy enough as a society.
What happens to the quality of life when there are no economic drivers in Hawaii? Quality.
Well, so you're dead, so it doesn't matter. Right? You have no income, so you have to leave. So that's what I'm talking about. Did you guys get that part?
Because we need money. So we're dead if we don't have money.
Well, you don't have money except for growing your own food, right? There's no way we can support today's standard of living without the kind of economy we have today, in which your standard of living, your ability to eat and enjoy the fine arts or whatever, is vastly greater than it's ever been in the history of the world. If you take the ability to have that away, you will have a lower standard of living. So, and some people are starving now, right? Their exit strategy is to leave. I think that's what young people in Hawaii are doing today. So I don't think there's a big dispute about this, but that's the challenge for the future. Did I understand the question correctly?
I think you got it, and you answered it pretty harshly. That's the way you are. You come right at it. It's an interesting question. Why would you, I don't know if you're intentionally excluding it, but excluding Hawaiian culture from a knowledge-based economy? I mean, it seems to be drawing a distinction between a knowledge-based economy and Hawaiian cultural body of knowledge. Can you connect those two?
No, I didn't exclude it. I mean, I just mentioned two. One I know more about, which is maize breeding, and one I know not as much about, which is astronomy, which is a big industry. So I'm sure that's on the list, right? We used to not have a Department of Hawaiian Studies at the University of Hawaii, and now we do. That's a good indication of what we're talking about. Wally used to not have a job up on the top of Mauna Kea, and now he does. That's another good indication. Hulalai is able to be an educator and a teacher to the world of these, great traditions. And I mean, did that happen before Hukulea? When I was growing up, I never heard about any of that stuff. So that's definitely on the list.
It wasn't on your list. You had a list.
Hawaiian, I didn't have a list. I just used two examples I'm sorry?
You did list some knowledge-based industries.
Well, I was primarily focused on science-based, but I listed 4. I mean, there are many more.
Most of the graduates of UH Hilo passionately oppose the TMT. When the Board of Regents refused to listen to the mana'o, it devalues their education. What's the economic impact of discrediting those graduates and devaluing their Hawaiian studies program? You get to that, or you can pass?
Well, I was not aware that there were data on So there's like survey data, is that what the question is? And most students oppose it? But I mean, was there like a vote?
It was a 7-hour meeting, and I can count on one hand how
Yeah, but
many
you guys,
people
I mean, nothing
supported.
personal, you guys would have hours and hours of discussion if we were gonna get into that. That doesn't, I'm just saying,
3 minutes.
okay, I'm just saying, if there are a majority of students that oppose it, then that would be a really interesting fact to actually see reported and, you know, or whatever. And then the rest of the question was something about their, sorry, can you repeat the rest of the question about devaluing their?
Wine studies.
This is just a personal question for you. What do you hold sacred?
That's an interesting question. You know, the memory of the family members I was privileged to know that are no longer with us. You know, a lot of the things I remember from growing up that don't seem to be true about Hawaii anymore. Things like that.
Things like
The biggest day I ever surfed a place on the windward side of Oahu, which will remain unnamed because there is no surf on the windward side of Oahu. These are not the joys you're looking for. Things like that. Dawn Patrol and back when the spinners used to come in and graze on the reef in Waikiki. That was, right? They don't do that anymore. So.
Okay, we're supposed to wrap this up at 9 o'clock. We've gone a little bit longer. There are some more. No, I don't see another economic question that is related to TMT. There's some about agriculture and food, and that it's, you know, that somehow it's problematic. There was another question that I want to get back to yours, and I don't know if you really got a handle on what was the relationship between the capital being spent on the mountain to build it, which may stay here, and the technology that's being applied to the mountain, which will be developed elsewhere. Do you have any insight in that, or maybe Stephanie is still around to touch on that? I don't know if she is, though.
I'm just going to look this up. So, so to give you a feel for, you know, the magnitudes of what we're talking about, if you include the fact that importables, imported building materials, for example, or imported professionally skilled individuals, operators of certain kinds of equipment and so on, you know, the mirrors in the telescope. If you take into account that we import certain things in the process of building them, then the multipliers, let me zoom this up for you so you get a feel for, then the multipliers in the state's model look something like this. So, all right, so what I used, for example, the line item I used in the detailed input-output model was something called heavy and civil engineering, and it's distinguished from housing construction, and then there's a third category of construction in the model. But to give you a feel for what we're talking about, in direct and indirect effects of that activity, every $1 billion you spend creates 1.44 billion in total Hawaii output. And if you include the induced effects, so direct, indirect, and induced effects, so other economic activities benefit from the presence of the one we're talking about, that's that multiplier 2. And you can see this pattern I talked about earlier. If you look at R&D in the physical, engineering, and life sciences as another sector, the multiplier is 2.02. And if you look at state and local government, because of, I don't know, whatever, it's 1.86. So 2 is the number, and the number is 2. And the reason is that the importables essentially vent some of that expenditure out of the economy, right? And then the rest stays in the economy, and in the interdependency of all the industries in the economy. And they, let's see if I can give you an example. So if you look at the, here's an example. This is the output table. So, here's flowers and nursery products, macadamia nuts, coffee, right? All the sectors are in the model. And the imported part of what everybody is doing is vented, and then the interdependence of industries on each other is included, and that's what works out to the number 2. So it's, it's like that for Hawaii. Hawaii has a higher import propensity. We're a small open economy. We tend to be more dependent on the rest of the world. But the flip side of that is we're also more dependent on exporting than most countries in the world. And that's how we, the way we finance our imports is by engaging in our exports.
That's a good economics response to that. Kiko, you got a quick one?
Yeah, it's usual to have cost-benefit analysis, and I put up a question right when I heard him say, I'm not talking about cost. And my question is about cost. Clearly there are some economic benefits, but what about, say, the cost to taxpayers of having to defend a lawsuit against a non-complying use in a conservation zone, for example?
So that was where that there. Any thoughts on how to compare the cost to public in fighting the battle?
So hire me and I will do it, but in my own sort of review of the literature, I read the environmental impact statement. I'm not getting that they did that. My impression, I've never seen anybody do it, ever. I used to teach it in college. Yeah, the cost-benefit analysis.
Okay.
And it is mandated in a lot of federal, so in many federal public investments, it's been mandated for quite some time. I mean, back when I was a graduate student in the late 70s, we talked about this a lot. And you may recall the late 70s, early 80s were a period of deregulation in many areas of the economy, transportation among them, later telecommunications and so on. Financial services was a big one in the course of my career. But outside of fairly narrow area of public investments, although this you would have thought might have been in that neighborhood, I'm not aware of any formal requirements, and I've often been struck by the fact that I've never seen it required in a state or a county project. The analysis I did, right, is a sort of a straightforward net present value calculation, but now that's a little different because if I were to include environmental costs, I'm guessing it wouldn't negate, but it's a really important area of active research among my colleagues in Hawaii, and I kind of hang out with them a little bit. I was a natural resource econ guy in graduate school, and then I went over to the dark side. And the problem is the valuation problem, right? Because there's a real problem. For example, there's a big gap between our willingness to pay to preserve the environment or preserve natural resources. So that, there's a number, like $1.80, that's what we pay DLNR to protect all of Hawaii's natural resources. And then another number, which is our willingness to accept compensation to never be able to enjoy those natural resource or cultural resources. That's a huge number. For some people, it's positive infinity. Okay, so that's, right, so no telescopes because it's infinitely valuable to me. That's a position of many people. And then, there's, the reason we have a political system is there's a social preference revelation mechanism that reveals to us, or decision makers in some broad sense, with any luck, with the help of rigorous benefit cost analysis, what the net benefits are, if any. So yeah, I would be in favor of it. I mean, I make my living doing that stuff, so I got to be careful about this. It's not just, I want more work, which I do. But I think we're missing out on a lot of that. in general. I don't know that much about this project. My sense is that a wide variety of environmental and cultural impacts were identified. They were at least enumerated. It's not clear to me they were estimated, but I haven't heard a lot of estimates in general. And I think that goes to the deeper issue of this really gnarly problem of valuing our natural resources. I was on a project about 10 years ago with my colleagues. We valued the upland watershed shoreline nexus in the coal laws at about $10 billion. It's just a number to put out
But
there.
if you keep destroying the
And-
INA and keep pouring concrete, the tourists that you're always talking about won't want to come here. So you've got to think about it from that standpoint as well.
And it was more a kind of a number to get people's attention and just to say, you know, if you impair, so the concept is natural capital. You know, we think of the physical concrete, there's physical capital, we've got a school, here's public capital, we've got a road, there's public capital. What about the natural capital with which we were endowed, or the cultural legacies
But
with
the
which we were endowed?
environment is irreplaceable.
Hey, so am I.
You keep pouring concrete.
I've
And-
always respected you. I voted for you in the law for
I'm
years.
sorry.
I asked him a question. He's trying to answer it.
So-
I can say everything you're saying, but I'm not.
You guys, it's okay.
Oh, my.
The point is, a more rigorous analytical treatment of costs as well as benefits can only elucidate, right? It can only make for better decision making. And I'd love to be involved in it.
Thank you sincerely.
Thank you very much, Paul. We have, Paul, thank you for coming. A round of applause for Paul, please.